Good morning. Fantastic to see so many people here. I'm Margaret Macintyre Latta, Director of the Okanagan School of Education. And to open our forum today, it's a privilege to have Dr. Bill Cohen with us to offer a traditional welcome to the territory.
Ahoy, Waikuchkich, Waipuchiap, Cooksulpina, Cochwelchwelt. So this Cooksulpina, Cochwelchwelt, you can consider it a prayer, a greeting, an acknowledgement, a ritualized practice. It's one of the everyday practices that our elders have passed on to us, and it's got some connotations. It means that it's a new morning, we made it through the night, everything we need is at hand, and it's good to come alive with the new day. And we've got some of the other notions, Waipchiap, Peace Naksilu, Waipchiap, Peace Slachalacht. So greet you as relatives, as friends, and this greeting is also what I'll call a ritualized practice. So when we say why is an acknowledgement that what's done is done, the past has happened, and when we come together, we've got imagination, we've got capability, we've got knowledge, and we can make good things happen. So that's how I'd like to welcome everybody and bring everybody together here. And this time of year, it's also the time of year for the Sukanakin Skeilach winter dance time, the Snehwam. So for a while, the winter dances were outlawed, but they continued anyways. And what they're about is in halls and in longhouses throughout the Columbia Plateau right now. There are people are getting together and they're giving thanks to the Tamich. So Tamich, keep this concept in mind. All the plants, the animals, the earth, the water are all communities, and they all have these life force strands of all these different plant and animal species and streams and rivers that are all emanating out from this place. They give us everything we need to survive and live well. And our responsibility as humans is to appreciate all of that and make sure that they continue to keep coming back to life too. So that's what's happening right now. So in accord with that, they always go in a counterclockwise direction. And we'll kind of move our dialogue in a counterclockwise direction too, unwind a bit. And yeah. Limlimt.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by providing a little bit of context for what brings this panel together today to discuss reconciling pedagogies. So each speaker today represents a faculty of education on a campus across Canada. And collectively, we understand that Canadian educators must respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. It's a weighty responsibility, an important responsibility. And in reading the TRC final report, attention is drawn to generational trauma, ongoing racism, colonial legacy. And it's clear in the world that we live in right now that these continue to shape relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. So while rightly documenting the horrors and ongoing violence characterizing this relationship, the TRC document is also a very hopeful document for Canadians through its calls to action. But hope by itself isn't going to cut it. hope by itself is not going to imbue reconciliation. I find many Canadians, many educators, including myself, encountering a lack of understanding of Indigenous peoples and cultures in their region. We might know the broad brushstrokes of Indigenous histories, but may not be able to connect this big picture to ways of knowing and being in the lands on which we teach, learn, and live. And without these understandings, many of us do not feel capable of responding to the calls to action. Globally, for some time, classrooms are recognized as sites to address civil, racial, ecological, and social tensions and inspire reconciliation. But I believe that a starting place needs to be local traditions, local stories, local perspectives, local concerns. Reconciliation is tied to particular relationships in particular places. So our panel today is intended to generate continued conversations today and beyond into the role and nature of reconciling pedagogies in classrooms. And I've asked each speaker to draw on their particulars of their places and their personal narratives of experience. And each presenter will speak for approximately 5 minutes. We'll have a collective conversation with all of you, so save up your questions and concerns and perspectives to share at the end of the presentation. And we're super honored to have such accomplished scholars and educators with us today. And I want to tell you just a little bit about each one. Dr. Dwayne Donald is Papaches Cree and Professor of Curriculum Studies and Indigenous Philosophies at the University of Alberta. He is Vice President of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education, and his research commitments are guided by Plains Cree and Blackfoot wisdom insights and the ways in which these can meaningfully influence understandings of teaching and learning today. And Dr. Jan Hare is a professor and associate dean for Indigenous Education at UBC Vancouver and serves as a member of the Okanagan School of Education Indigenous Education Council. As an Anishinaabe scholar and educator, her research is concerned with improving educational outcomes for Indigenous learners by centering Indigenous knowledge systems within educational reform from early childhood to post-secondary education. Dr. Nicholas Ng-A-Fook is a professor and director of the teacher education program at the University of Ottawa. He's the president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. This is the largest professional education research association in Canada. Across administrative, educational, and research capacities, he's committed toward addressing the 94 calls to action in partnership with local Indigenous and school board communities. Dr. Sandra Styres is at the University of Toronto. She's of Mohawk, English, and French descent. She's also a Canada Research Chair in Land, Resurgence, Reconciliation, and the Politics of Education, and an assistant professor within the Department of Curriculum, Teaching, and Learning. Dr. Styres' research interests are extensive, oriented towards ethics and protocols that guide the work in Indigenous and non-Indigenous research collaborations and community engagement. And Dr. Bill Cohen, currently at Okanagan College, but as of July, an assistant professor with the Okanagan School of Education, And Dr. Cohen is from the Okanagan Nation, with extensive kinship ties throughout British Columbia and Washington. He specializes in the areas of Indigenous knowledge, research, education, and transforming pedagogy. He's an educator, artist, storyteller, and author. So I look forward to our panel presentations today, and we're going to let Dr. Dwayne Donald get underway.
Tanse totemtik, niwa mogantik, kakyo kitatum skata noao. I hope you don't mind hearing a little bit of Cree this morning. I wish I could remember some of the words that Bill taught us, but I'll have to practice a bit more. But I just greet you all this morning, this beautiful place. I'm happy to have a chance to be here with all of you. Normally at events like this, I take about a half an hour to introduce myself, but I heard that Nicholas asked for more time, so I'll try to give it up if I can. I'll just tell you right now, I have a couple of names besides Dwayne. One is Mr. Haya Nitsi Gasun, so my Cree name is Big Bear. And I also have a Blackfoot name, Nisto Nitsi Tapi Paksum Epio Mahka. That's a long-distance runner, somebody who runs a long time. I guess where I'll begin with this short introduction is just to let you know that I was born and raised in Edmonton. I spent the first 24 years of my life there, and as a child of the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of things going on in my family that I didn't really understand very well because no one was talking about it. And probably a lot of you understand that now. I don't blame anybody. That's just the way it was. But there's lots of things in my life that are really important that I didn't know anything about back then. So I come from a community that was part of Treaty 6, and the land was taken away in 1895, and my ancestors were chased away. This is basically the south side of Edmonton now, Papasies. And so, I grew up in a place where my roots are quite deep. Didn't know that when I was that age. But things really changed for me dramatically when I got a job teaching at a place called Kainai High School, which is a Kainai First Nation in southern Alberta, Blackfoot country. And down there, just through curriculum development projects and working with elders, I was basically brought into a tradition where Blackfoot people could map their territory based on the stories and the traditions and the ceremonies. And so as a teacher, I was part of this field trip project where the elders would take us to these places, and I learned about all these beautiful Blackfoot understandings. It's like a Blackfoot imagination and in connection to the place that they have deep roots in. And I remember while I was down there, Leroy Little Bear, who's someone that some of you may have heard of, he's a longtime professor at the University of Lethbridge. He said, when the land doesn't recognize you anymore, that's when you have an ID problem. And of course, I took that very personally, right? So when I made it back home, about 17 years ago now, I returned back to Edmonton, and right away, because I had this Blackfoot imagination that I was carrying around with me, I thought, what are our stories? Where are our sacred places? And so since then, I would say, I've been working in a way where the land recognizes me as a relative in the place where I'm from. And so a lot of that, if you've been to Edmonton, we have this beautiful river valley in there. And so one of the things that I do is I take people for walks in the river valley and just share with them some of the stories that I know about, I guess, the many layers of history, memory, experience that are there. So, hi.
Is this on? I'm good? Okay, I'm good here. I decided to stand since I tend to get a little animated. My hands start to go, and then I thought I'd be hitting these two on the side. So if anyone's ever watched the MOOC, the massive open online course MOOC that I developed at UBC, Reconciliation Through Indigenous Education, if you ever watch me on video, I talk a lot with my hands, and I wanted to have that opportunity to do that. So Bojo, Ani, Janice Hare, Deschniakaz, Anishinaabe, Chiging, and Jojem. So my name is Jan Hare. I'm Anishinaabe, and I come from a reserve community in Northern Ontario, the Chiging First Nation. That's my father's community, and I'm a member of that community, and my mother is from the Bear Island First Nation, so even a smaller reserve community in Northern Ontario. So that's where my roots are from. But I live and work on Coast Salish territories and the traditional ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. And so, and also in my travels, it takes me a lot of different places, a lot of different territories and lands of other Indigenous peoples. And so for many of you as educators, you'll be traveling to different territories, and how important it is to come to know the protocols of being in that place, and really and deepening your understanding of what it means to be in place, and developing those relationships. I thought I'd speak a little bit. I had something else planned, and then I was sort of rethinking it and wanted to do something perhaps a little more experiential. And so I want to share a story with you. And this is it's a story by Tu'a educator Terry Tafoya. It is called Coyote's Mismatched Eyes. And it's a story that's a public story, so that's why I share that story, but recognize I'm in another territory in which I'm sharing this story. And it's as I said, it's a public story. It's a story that Terry Tafoya himself tells. It's available. You can see it online. Joanne Archibald shares this story in her book, Storywork. And so it's Coyote, and Coyote's out wandering, as Coyote usually does. And he's about wandering, and he hears a song being sung. And he moves towards the song, and he sees Rabbit. And it's Rabbit singing his spirit song. And he sees Rabbit singing the spirit song. He's listening and he's watching. And after he sings that song, Rabbit, his eyes fly out, and they perch themselves on a rock nearby. And then he calls, "Wee Nun," and the eyes come flying back in. And Coyote thinks this is just so wonderful. He's like, this is a really wonderful trick. This is something really quite magnificent. I'd really like to be able to do that. So he approaches Rabbit and says, "Will you share your, I'd like to be able to do that. Will you teach me how?" And Rabbit says, "Well, Coyote, that's my spirit song. It's a very special song." He says, no, please teach me. And he pesters and bothers him, and making requests on him to teach him that song. So Rabbit finally gives in and teaches him his spirit song, but with a caution, and says, if you sing that song more than 4 times, if you sing that song 4 times, he says, something bad's going to happen. And Coyote's like, yes, of course. And for those of you who've heard trickster stories, shapeshifter stories, transformer stories, we know it's through the deeds and misantics of the trickster that we come to know understandings about the world around us, and how we are to act in that world. So off he goes to wander the world. And he sings this song thinking it's just so wonderful. And he sings the song, his eyes fly out, they perch themselves on the ground. "Wee Nun," he calls them back in. And he's thinking, this is just so wonderful. This is such a wonderful thing that I can do. He's starting to fill himself with a bit of conceit. So starts to walk about, wandering about, and again says, I'm really liking this. This is quite amazing. So sings the spirit song, sings Rabbit's spirit songs. The eye flies out, and he calls, he calls, yes, and the eyes fly back. So off he is about wandering around, and he's really liking this. He's thinking this is such a magnificent thing that he's able to do. This is just so wonderful. So he sings a spirit song, his eyes fly out, and he calls, and they fly back in. And he thinks, why am I keeping this to myself? Why am I keeping this really wonderful feat to myself? I should really be showing everybody what I can do. So he wanders into the village, and he calls all the humans around, and he brings them all around, and they're like, oh, Coyote, what is it? What is it this time, Coyote? So they gather around, and Coyote sings his song, sings his spirit song. His eyes fly out, they perch up on a tree, and just as he's about to call, and just before he's about to call that, this bird flies down, scoops up his eyes, and flies off. But he calls, but the eyes don't return. So of course all the humans, they're laughing. They think this is quite humorous and typical of Coyote's antics. So they all disperse and they leave Coyote on his own. So Coyote's left on his own to wander about with no eyes. And as he starts to wander about the world, he can hear the river, and he makes his way to the river. And he reaches down, and he starts to stir up the water, picks up some bubbles, puts them into his eyes, looks about very excited, and they pop. Tries it again, stirs up, puts some bubbles in, and they pop. And he's like, this is not going to work. So off he goes to wander the world. And he starts to feel his way around, and he's feeling his way around. He comes across some prickly bushes, and he's feeling around. There's some nice, soft, little round things on this bush, so he picks them up, puts them in, and he looks about, and he can't see anything. It's all black. He's picked up some blackberries, and so he takes them out and says, well, these aren't going to be very helpful. So off he goes to wander the world. And he's starting to feel sorry for himself by this point. He's a little sad, starting to whine a bit that he can't see. And all of a sudden he hears a little voice. And a little voice says, Coyote, what's wrong? And Coyote says, oh, Cousin Mouse, I explains to him, I've learned the spirit song, I wasn't listening, I sang it 4 times, and my eyes didn't return, and he's explaining all this to Mouse. And Mouse says, oh, Cousin Coyote, I have 2 eyes. I'll give one to you. So Mouse passes his eye to Coyote. If you think about the size of a mouse, very small, and the size of Coyote. So he puts it in and lets it roll and roll and roll about, and it settles, and off he goes to wander the world. But as he's wandering about, it's a small eye, doesn't let in a lot of light, and so he starts to feel a bit sorry for himself again. Starts whining a bit, complaining a bit, feeling a bit sad. And all of a sudden he hears this booming voice. And this booming voice says, Cousin Coyote, what's the matter? I can hear you, what's wrong? And Coyote says, Cousin Buffalo, explains to him the story of how he had lost his eyes and how Mouse was kind enough to share one of his eyes with him. And so Buffalo says, oh, Coyote, I have 2 eyes. I'll share one with you. And so Buffalo gives him one of his eyes. And if you think about the size of a buffalo and the size of a coyote, so he takes that eye and he puts it in, and he's putting it in and shoving it in, and it's kind of hanging out. And then off he goes to wander the world. And that's the end of my story. And I think that's some of the nature of our storytelling traditions in terms of the different structures, perhaps, that our stories have, and that it may not have the resolve that you as the listener had hoped for. And if I had time, I would ask you to make meaning from this story, having you think about it, think about this story in relationship to your own lives. I might ask you also about, what themes might resonate from this story for you. But as I said, I don't have time. And so in thinking about this story, I want to give you some thoughts, I guess, as you organize your day and have conversations throughout the day. Thinking about that big eye and that small eye. Dr. Archibald talks about that as the large eye being perhaps, these dominant approaches to education, Western Eurocentric approaches to education that tend to overshadow that smaller eye, those indigenous perspectives, indigenous approaches to education. And so I guess my question for you is, how do we reconcile, right? How do we reconcile this big eye and this small eye? How can these approaches to education coexist together? Not as either or, but how these can coexist together. So how do we reconcile that? thinking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls of action that have been put forward to us. But also thinking about, we're in the province of British Columbia, and the BC government has passed legislation implementing the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this confers new responsibilities for us. It's an opportunity to reset our relationship, I think, with Indigenous peoples who maybe we haven't embraced or haven't worked as closely with. I think the work of the Reconciliation Commission, the UNDRIP, allows us, or the declaration allows us to reset those kinds of relationships. But it also confers a different kinds of responsibilities for us as educators. And so how can we see things from different perspectives in the way that Coyote is having to see things? And I also think about the selfless acts of mouse and the selfless acts of buffalo in the way they shared, and also thinking about Coyote and how he approached Rabbit, making that request, and did so in a very aggressive kind of way, making that request for knowledge not really an appropriate way, or attending to protocol in asking. And so we need to ask ourselves, how can we engage with Indigenous peoples in ways that are respectful? How do we engage with Indigenous peoples in ways that advance their priorities, advance Indigenous education priorities for their own communities and for their own learners, particularly in the context of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that's, we need to push ourselves a bit further, and some of us are just really coming to understand, as Dr. Latta had pointed out, some of us are really just coming to understand the significance of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we need to continue to educate ourselves in this new context here in British Columbia, a new policy context. And so I hope the story that I shared with you today, I hope the questions that I posed to you today give you that opportunity to pause and reflect in a new policy context. So, miigwech.
Kwe kakina, good morning, bonjour. I don't think, I'm from Ottawa. I'm from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin people. And, I'm a first-generation immigrant, settler immigrant to Canada. Our family came in 75. I was 2 at the time. I was born in Glasgow, Scotland. Ng-A-Fook, my last name, is my great-grandfather's first name is Fook, and his last name's Ng, and they were Hakka. They were from originally from the middle of China and made their way down to the south of China, and then were part of one of China's largest civil wars. And when Britain sought to abolish slavery in the 1830s, they needed another workforce for their settler colonial system. So my family came over in the 1870s on my dad's side to Georgetown, Guyana, and they worked as indentured laborers on a plantation for 2 years, and then were free and got into business. And my grandfather eventually ran an ice cream cone factory during the 1960s. He was able to get a loan from the dictator at the time, Bernard Ford, who, like Castro, was renationalizing the government and business in Guyana. And so my grandfather traveled to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and got an ice cream cone factory, and was able to save up enough money to send his kids to go to the UK to go to school in the 1960s and 70s. And my father met my mom, who's Irish-Scottish, and on that side of the family, my great-grandfather was Kenny. He fought with the Irish Republican Army, and they lost that war as well. And so we're a bunch of migratory losers in many ways. We also joke, if you go anywhere in the world, you can find a Chinese food restaurant on one side of the street and an Irish pub on the other. So it was only a matter of time before my 2 parents met. But in terms of what you see going on in the world right now and Brexit, that was taking place at that time when I was born in the 1970s, that countries across the world were working in many ways in terms of seeking out their own independence and then wanting to travel and maintain British citizenship. And so different laws were passed in the UK to prevent that impacted people like my father. So even though my father was married to someone like my mother, he couldn't get British citizenship. So here in Canada, you had Trudeau Sr., who, and the government initiated multiculturalism and part of the Constitution and changed the way in which they saw migration. So we came in 75, I was 2. We lived in Scarborough, Toronto for a bit. And then we moved up to, my dad went for a road trip up to Kapuskasing. And I grew up in Kapuskasing, a small rural logging town in northern Ontario, until I left for university at the University of Ottawa. And I share that story in many ways because that's the story that we shared around the household table. That's the story that I learned in school about coming over and becoming a good Canadian citizen. And my parents enrolled me in the French Catholic schooling system, donc je parle français aussi. S'il y en a qui étudient d'enseigner français ici à Kelowna, well, I say bonjour to you as well. And my parents thought to become good Canadian citizens was to learn both colonial languages. So we never talked about Kapuskasing or what Kapuskasing meant in the Anishinaabe-Moan language. We never talked about it meaning the bend in the river. We never acknowledged in the school curriculum, except for in derogatory ways, the people, whoever's traditional territories we were on and living on. And that went on. I went to university, to my undergrad at University of Ottawa, still, studied the classics and learned about the Greeks and the Romans. And it wasn't until, I went over to Australia to do my teacher ed degree in Penrith, same thing. Over there, learning to become a history teacher and science teacher. And it wasn't until I came back and did my master's at York University, I had a prof, Celia Haig-Brown, said, Nick, all right, you got your story of being an immigrant to Canada, want to be part of a socially cohesive settler society, want to participate in the capitalistic economy, but what's that mean in terms of whose traditional territories you're on? And so my research question, and maybe this might be something you might take up during your conversations today, my research question for my master's thesis was, what does it mean to decolonize oneself? And so for my master's studies, it was a teacher that provoked me to ask that question. Even though I had a settler colonial curriculum as part of my formal education up until that point in time. And so I'm like, well, how does one answer that question? Where does one begin? And part of that was just reading in Indigenous scholarship to start with, because I didn't have those relationships. So my master's thesis was a lot of reading in terms of Indigenous scholars and starting there as a starting place. And then when I went and did my PhD down at Louisiana State University, I was fortunate enough to work and live with the largest Franco-Indigenous community in Louisiana and continue to ask that question with them in relation to place and how they ended up where they did. So just end with one story to kind of illustrate in terms of what Dr. Hare was shared with you is they were fighting their ongoing petition to be recognized by the federal government in the United States. And so they're recognized by the state, but not the federal government. And one of the criteria is you need to demonstrate that you're a cohesive community. So if you look at Louisiana, it's got 5 fingertips. And the 5 fingertips, there's 5 different communities on those fingertips. So when agents would come down from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they'd drive down the road and they'd have to cross a bayou, right? So they'd have to drive down a highway or come back up the highway. There's only one bridge, they go down and they go back up. Well, that drive could take 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. And they said, well, there's no way you could be a group because it takes so long by car to drive up and down. But they had been going by pirogue for 100 years in between and crossing the river. So even the kind of mindset in terms of an automobile versus a pirogue and the way in which the interconnections in relation to place and community. And so while I was down there, and it used to be the joke, the principal chief, Brenda Darda Rebbe show, she's like, Nick, are you here to do your PhD or just to fish? because I would go and fish with her son all the time. And it was through fishing and speaking to elders that I began to learn the history of place, the politics of place, and even the movement. That when you're in a pirogue traveling along the marsh as opposed to driving, there's so many things you see with a small eye or big eye that you don't get to see when you're driving in a car. So anyways, I look forward to discussing any questions you might have.
Skanoge, that's the way my people greet one another, and it means is that great peace upon you. And it's the way of beginning to enter into relationship. And so part of that is I'm going to tell you how our people moved from their traditional territories to where they are now. And as many of you know, we don't recognize that colonial border. That's a colonial border that was imposed that did not dictate where our traditional territories were. So the Haudenosaunee people occupied much of what is considered now to be Upper New York State into Montreal, into parts of Ontario. After the War of Independence, it became increasingly difficult and life-threatening for us to remain in where we were in our traditional lands. So because we sided with the British, we said, hey, it's your fault we're in this mess, so you need to find land for us somewhere else. So the British, in their great wisdom, dispossessed the Mississaugas of the Credit River and gave us land on either side of the Grand River, 6 miles on either side, from its inception to where it empties into the Great Lake. And that was under the Haldimand Deed. So we occupied much of our traditional territories post-contact until after the war. Pardon me? Oh, sorry. Sorry. And until after the War of Independence in the United States. Prior to contact, the Anishinaabeg nations and the Haudenosaunee nations and their allies created a treaty under which they would live, this piece of land would listen, they could exist in peaceable existence. So in other words, it would be a neutral meeting place, it would be a hunting ground, it would be a place where people could commune and meet, and there would be no bloodshed. And that's under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Agreement, which essentially meant that everyone recognized that everyone needed a place, and that they would only take as much as they needed so that everyone else could have what they needed. The spoon represents the fact that there would be no sharp instruments, there would be no bloodshed. This was a place of peace. That's the place where U of T and OISE sits. So what does that mean? When you walk the campus and you see these signs erected like flags that are espousing the colonialists who have set up U of T without acknowledging whose traditional lands they're on. The Haudenosaunee people are made up of 6 distinct nations. It was originally 5. Quite a bit later, the Tuscarora joined us as little brothers. We took them under our wing because they were experiencing prosecution. They came from the Carolinas somewhere and migrated north. So we took them under our wing. The 6 Nations is under this confederacy that joins them all together, which is why you see those 5 arrows bundled, because separately we weren't as strong as we were together. And if you look, you will see that symbol on many government logos. That's that symbol of the 5 arrows bound together. The Haudenosaunee people, we had extensive trade routes, east, west, north, and south. The colonists soon realized that we were the gateway to the north, and so they signed an agreement with us called the Silver Covenant Chain. The reason why it was called the Silver Covenant Chain was because if it was iron, it would rust. If it was silver, it would never rust, but if not taken care of, would tarnish. The Silver Covenant Chain are the philosophical principles of the relationship. The Gaswenta, or the Tura Wampum, as many of you might know, was the actual action of how that relationship would be taken up and looked into. And those relationships are still in full force and effect. So when we look at reconciliation, we look at who's polishing that chain, whose responsibility is it to make that relationship right? Whose responsibility is it to polish that chain? I just finished some research looking at the ways some universities in Ontario were choosing to take up the TRC's calls to action. What we found was most folks, most administrators, institutional actors, faculty, didn't know what reconciliation was, didn't know what their responsibilities was in that process, didn't know what it was to look like or even where to begin, so they did nothing. Or they would do things like check boxes. We'll do a compulsory course. We'll do rote land acknowledgements. I'm part of a group of folks called the Deepening Knowledge Project. And we spent 2 hours one night thinking about what do land acknowledgements mean and whose responsibility is to take them up. And one of the things that we decided to do after 2 hours of exhaustive wordsmithing was that we would do a very basic land acknowledgement, but put a challenge at the end of it. And the challenge is for those folks to take up their responsibilities, to make it personal, to choose how they were going to enact their responsibilities, not only in the reconciliation process, but living and working on lands that exist first and foremost in relationship with Indigenous peoples. And so we challenge them to reach beyond that low-hanging fruit and to think about reconciliation in the context of critical social action. And what does that mean? And how do you build relationships to Indigenous people and stand in solidarity beside them? And, you know, these terms such as allyship and all of those things get bandied about where people self-identify without really understanding what it means. And that it's not it's not for outsiders to choose to call themselves allies, but that the Indigenous people that you bring yourself in alliance with, they're the ones that determine through your actions if you are an ally and how you exist in relationship. And these things are very place-specific. What works in my area would look very differently or be expressed very differently. Land is a common theme that I discovered in my work amongst Indigenous peoples, not only across Canada, the United States, Hawaii, and I list Hawaii separate from the United States, and New Zealand. And it's relationships to place, relationships to land, relationships to waterways is a universal theme amongst us. However, the ways they get expressed are very place-specific. Stories are very place-specific. And so how do you bring those knowledges into the classroom? And for some of us, they're connected to our understandings of the philosophies that are embedded in our places, the stories that are embedded in our places, the coyote story, our trickster stories, our elders. All of those stories are embedded in our places. So thank you.
Well, I was thinking, should I sit here or should I stand over there? And so just a warning in case my hands get... Sandra will be ducking. And, so anyways, what I want to talk about and do some connecting to the others is talk about the indigenizing imagination. So we express that through a metaphor of bringing coyote back to life. And so coyote has a special gift from creation, a special power. Coyote can transform monsters just with his mind power. So these monsters, it's not that Okanagan folks or other Indigenous peoples are superstitious, that sort of thing. It's about storyways that have a keen understanding of human life patterns connected to the local ecology and biodiversity. And these monsters are metaphoric monsters, institutions, practices that are destructive, that eat our future children. So we need to transform those monsters so that they're useful and helpful and beneficial. So that's been a praxis that's worked for thousands of years. More recently, some of these knowledge stories and this metaphor is expressed by the Anaukin Center, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, various educators and artists who are sharing stories in public school curriculum and post-secondary. It's resonating. So one of the artists is Madeline Terbasket. She's got some really powerful storytelling. Coyote trying to fly. Anyways, I'll tell a very short, condensed version of that story. So Sinclair Coyote, he was watching Puckle-Cane, he was watching a golden eagle in the Similkameen. He was watching eagles soar above the cliffs, and he would swoop down, catch updrafts, and soar back up and let out eagle screams. And we were just having so much fun being eagle and riding the breeze. And so the more Coyote watched, the more he thought, you know what eagle is doing? That should be me up there. Those are my ways. I should be the one flying. I should be screaming and seeing everything from way up there. So he started climbing the cliff. It was really steep and really high. And he kept sliding down, and he kept climbing and climbing, getting all skinned up and scraped up and bloody. But finally he was determined, because he'd look up, there was eagle, catch another updraft and soar off and glide into the distance. So finally he got to the top of the cliff, and he dusted himself off, and he walked to the edge, and he stepped off to catch an updraft. And poor Coyote doesn't have wings, he just got skinny little arms and skinny and a little tail, and he started plummeting down to the bottom. And he got so scared that he started screaming and howling and pooping and all the way down. He was just getting splattered and torn to pieces. And finally he got to the bottom, and that was the end of Coyote. And on that cliff, and that cliff is still there. It's just where the Ashnola river flows into the Similkameen River. There's a big cliff, and there's a large streak that goes down that cliff that reminds us of Coyote's journey. And so on that streak, there's a whole lot of sweat, blood, and poop, as Madeline puts it. But anyways, sometime later, Fox heard about what Coyote had done. And Fox came along and really carefully gathered up all the bits of Coyote he could find. And once he'd gathered up all those, some hair over here and a tooth and some bone shards, and gathered up all the pieces he could, and he breathed into the pile, and he stepped over it 4 times, and that pile transformed itself back into Coyote. And was he appreciative? Was he thankful? No, he was really annoyed that Fox was waking him up when he was just having a little nap, and they carried on. So that's one of the really key stories, and I just want to use that as a metaphor for us. So we, through creation and what Coyote shows us humans, we've got this incredible mind power. Sometimes it's destructive, sometimes it can mean that our life path might be short as humans and might be destructive. It's also, we need to take risks and all of that, but also when it is destructive, then the reflective aspect of who we are as Fox, we gather up the bits, we do research, we talk, we have dialogue, we create new understanding. And it's not enough to just create new understanding. We need to apply it and ritualize it into practice. So when we Fox steps over Coyote 4 times, what we're renewing is our mind power, our ability to transform monsters and create a more sustaining future. And that's what's worked pretty well. So we can think about it as before us humans arrived here, the land, the water, the plants, the animals, figured out how to live and how to live in a very interdependent, intertwined kind of systemic whole. And then us humans came along, and we don't have that same kind of know-how. we don't know how to live our lives in ways that contribute to the well-being of the future generations. So we can learn some of that from the natural world, and the natural world shows us we've got keystone species in our Okanagan epistemology. We've got food chiefs. The chief means to actually gather together all these strands of tamich, including us humans, and continuously bring them together into a stronger, interdependent whole. And that's what the Indigenous imagination is about. So in the past 150 years here, that relationship between humans and the natural ecology, or this bioregion, whatever term we want to call it, we call it our Timhulau. The relationship between humans and the natural ecology has changed from being one that's appreciating and respectful towards and singing songs of thanks. It's become more about exploitation and possession and ownership, this notion of reciprocity has changed. We haven't looked what we've been giving back to the natural world that gives us water and air and all the foods and medicines and material for houses and everything that we need. Our reciprocity has been giving it, we've been giving back a lot of pollution, a lot of species extinction, and we've got climate change and all of that. So we haven't been giving a lot of love back, so we'll look to change that a bit. And that's what, when I look at the Truth and Reconciliation, the 94 calls to action, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women National Inquiry, the 231 calls to justice. These are about understanding and efforts to change these past colonial relationships that are also very much influencing the present. So if we want to transform these stories about all of this systemic and institutionalized violence towards women, particularly Indigenous women, where it's highlighted, violence toward the Earth Mother, which is also connected to that history of patriarchy. And so we're going to change some of those notions, and we've got all kinds of isms in our past and present. Racism, sexism, forced assimilation, genocide, and exploitation in multiple sites, and this is why there's so many recommendations and so many calls to action. Has to be some systemic change if we're going to actually change anything. So Indigenous peoples and in the Okanagan here, I'll say that we've certainly been impacted, and we're not saying, oh, here's a utopian and it's so romanticized, but we need to look at, connect and look very pragmatically at what we're going to do for the future. So some projects that are in the Okanagan here, we've managed to bring back the Okanagan salmon, who are almost extinct, and that was a partnership of many Okanagan, many communities, scientists, DFO, and anyways, lots of work still to be done if we're going to assure that salmon keep coming back in the future. The Kingfisher Interpretive Center near Enderby. We've got Okanagan Seal folks and Shuhupmuk folks and all kinds of community members and students and working together to maintain the salmon and all of the biodiversity there. So we've got some good projects. And I'll say that reconciliation is or reconciling pedagogies is much more than what some of the others have mentioned. I would say it's much more than a racialized dialogue between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. So what there's potential, if we look at the past patterns, is that we have potential to reconcile human lifeways with each place or each site on the earth. In the Okanagan here, we've got got lots of opportunities for everyone to connect with the Okanagan people, with us. We're very friendly, and we've got a sense of humor as well. But anyways, and we've got a knowledge system, and it's not an either or. We need all of us putting our minds together and looking at how can we use our knowledge and imagination and imagine how we can address some of the floods, the fires, the environmental degradation, and all of those issues that are facing us. So there's not, well, I'd say we're lucky we're still here. We're lucky that everyone in Canada, wherever you are, you're in the homeland of an Indigenous people. So you can make connections, and we'll have before long, if we have some of this shared monster transforming coming together, I'd suggest that there's not a better way to address and resolve some of the dehumanizing, the racist and sexist patterns than to use extended family, children-centered pedagogy. So when we make ourselves extended family, then we can't be racist or sexist or violent towards our relatives. So this is one of the underpinnings, and I think the more we kind of take seriously that whatever we do now, whatever we inherit, whatever we practice, their schools, our institutions, that whether we like it or not, our collective children in the future are going to inherit that. So we might as well be proactive about it and put our minds together a bit. And we need to, as Margaret mentioned, have more than hope. And as Dwayne mentioned about the Blackfoot imagination and nurturing that, and Jan mentioned the trickster and story ways of multiple ways of knowing and understanding, and Nick with the story of connecting with Indigenous peoples with positive outcomes, and the Chinese food, which is very meaningful to me. It's become a tradition in my family. We, paydays, we go have Chinese smorgasbord. And also the challenge from Sandra. And what is your contribution? What is your song? So I mentioned this is the time of the winter dance, the Sneechwam. So in one of our stories, the winter dance was going on, and Mouse was invited to come and sing your song of thanks, of appreciation. So Mouse was quite adamant. He kept saying, "In chakin kwikuna, lutachin kunim. In chakin kwikuna, lutachin kunim. In chakin kwikuna, lutachin kunim. I am Mouse, and I have no song. I am Mouse, and I have no song." And everybody just started dancing. So we look forward, and as a larger community, helping everyone to find our songs of thanks, of appreciation, of interconnection. So limnant.
So thank you to our speakers for the particulars of their places, the personal narratives of experience. And now's a chance for each of you to give some questions, feedback, ideas, things that are wonderings that you have that you want to bring to either a specific panel member or the entire panel as a whole. And mics will be passed around. Kyle's got one there, and Jody's got one. So just raise your hand if you have a question or comment. I know there's lots out there. I can feel the thinking. Someone be brave.
This question is for Nick. I'm just curious about, for yourself, in your daily work and in your journey, what informs your practice day to day to keep that decolonizing practice at the center of your work?
That's a really good question. I'm still trying to figure that out. But it becomes very frustrating. I think first as a teacher to start personally, to do that work on your own, and ask those questions. So I'm working on that, and then if you are lucky enough to have students one day, to do that work with them in whatever capacity, and the kind of questions that you ask about the curriculum. So I've got 3 boys. I've got a 14-year-old, 12-year-old, and 10-year-old. And if you wait for the curriculum at the school to kind of address some of these questions that are put forth in the 94 calls to action, or truth and reconciliation, prior to truth and reconciliation, what's to come after it, I feel that I'm going to wait too long. So even though we're talking about it here, the evidence of it in classrooms or schools that's not done in a tokenistic way, I don't necessarily see there yet. So my youngest son, for example, this year, I've been working with the Algonquin of Kitigan-Zibi, which is, it's about 90 minutes north and near Maniwaki in Quebec. And my youngest son often comes with me on trips that we do when I go to work with elders or residential school survivors. And he comes and he sits. And actually, I was tired of my sons doing the same project in grade 5, the Me to We project. And so I said, we're going to try and do something different. And at the Kikamanan School in Kitigan-Zibi, Celine White Duck, she has a club called Kinawin, which means we. So there's no me to we, it's we. And I asked if Jonah could collaborate on a project with them. And so he's gone up maybe once or twice a month, and we've been working with students there, and he's doing his part of what he's agreed to with the club in Ottawa, and trying to connect. And then he's been asked to kind of then share that with his classmates, but he's also been invited to other places to talk about that work. And I think that's part of it, is trying to reach out to community members. And I think Celine, she said for reconciliation, it's not just about as teachers doing work, but when are our families going to hang out? As much like when are we going to hang out? Like that would be like in developing those kinds of relations. So that's part of it. And then as director of teacher ed, former director of teacher ed, I finished last year, was trying to get students, profs, to think about if you're thinking about that we're living, like if we want to talk about financial literacy, that it's been a history of building equity for certain people over time, and others to deny the building of equity over time. So we're just talking about economic equity, like whether it's the Lands Dominion Act and appropriation of land, and then families being able to build equity over time. Then if we're profiting from that, like coming here today and profiting from that, then what's our responsibilities in those initial treaty relations, or the relations that we haven't established yet, like with the Algonquin, as our citizens, not waiting for the federal government, not waiting for municipal or provincial, but what can you do as a citizen as your commitment to that? So that's where I'm at right now. I'm like, okay, I go and I advocate and ask for stuff, but it's always like, as Cindy Blackstock would say, like incremental equity or equality, as opposed to there needs to be some big jumps in terms of the mindset where we're at. So trying to think about what I can do in that way. Like, so to live in Ottawa on these traditional territories, what are my role and responsibilities as a family, and then as a professional, and as a teacher? So how can we teach differently? The stories we teach at school, how can we teach them differently?
Another question, comment? Linda.
Hi, I really enjoyed hearing all of your opening comments. Thank you so much for sharing. And right from the beginning, when Dr. Cohen shared the meaning behind the greeting, the Silux, it just reminds me that language is so embedded, so much knowledge and worldview is embedded in language. And I know know that's a big conversation around here in this territory. I'd like to hear from anyone who would like to speak to that. How important is it, or is it appropriate to share traditional languages with non-Indigenous children and the wider community who may not have that deep context of understanding, but is learning some basic language a way in? Is it something you think we need to be cautious of, or something that we need to open up almost fearlessly?
Bill?
I'll respond to that. There we go. Now I'll respond to that. So one of the, if we're going to change anything in terms of outcomes, so some of the outcomes of the, the past relationships that have been described have been the biodiversity has been diminishing, the cultural diversity has been diminishing, languages are all in, critical state and all of that. So if we're going to start changing that, then we need to change those outcomes so that Indigenous linguistic diversity becoming healthy and used and practiced. So that means it's what didn't happen in the past in the Okanagan here and elsewhere. In most cases, is that the language and knowledge has been here for thousands of years, has been excluded and not been it's been actually marginalized, and we've got all of that discourse about that. So it's also that if we're going to renew some of that, then it means sharing and learning and connecting to those concepts and ways too. We had this dialogue when I've been involved in some immersion school development. So one of the questions that came up in getting organized was, well, what if non-Okanagan kids want to come to the school, or what if non-Indigenous kids want to come to the school? So we looked at it and said, this isn't a project that continues to be exclusive. So, and actually there were non-Okanagan, some Indigenous, some non-Indigenous who were checked out the school curriculum and said, oh, we want our kids to be part of this. So yeah, there's some really fair, blonde-haired non-Indigenous folks who are learning, Okanagan language and interacting, becoming an extended family. So yeah, it's certainly something to be shared, and that's what the relationships are sorting that out. There is some hesitancy sometimes. Well, I don't know if I want to say it right, or I don't know if I'm qualified, and so then the more important notion is that if we don't do anything, then we know what the outcomes are, and they're all around us. So the worst we can do is keep things the same. The best, once we start, whether we're mouth saying, I don't have a song, and we'll start that dialogue or continue it.
Yeah. The way I've been guided on this, I guess, is that all the gifts that the people have, they're particular to the place where they live. And so that language belongs in that place. It doesn't belong anywhere else. And so if you're going to connect with that place, you have to know that language, because the language describes the place and the ecosystem that's there. And on this point, I've been, as Bill was speaking, I was remembering something I heard from Joseph Campbell, who some of you may who know who that is. He studied mythologies around the world. So it's sort of like, what are the stories that the people tell themselves about who they are and what matters to them? And he said, Joseph Campbell said that North American societies are very unique in the world, in that the stories and mythologies and understandings that are connected to the places where, settler societies live, they've tried to ignore them or dismiss them or eliminate them. And this is why the creation stories of North American societies are based mostly on power and control and resource exploitation. They're trying to overcome this problem of claiming somebody else's land. And so I would say the only way that, if we understand reconciliation as something more than just a human-to-human problem, I would say it also involves our more than human relatives, then one of the ways we can really try to connect with what it means to live well in a place is through that language that is intimately connected to the ecosystem there. And so to answer your question, as Bill said, it has to be for everyone who lives there.
I have a question. I'm really enjoying this conversation and the different perspectives, so thank you for that. So I'm wondering if you could help me clarify or understand the difference or the discourse that goes with indigenizing curriculum and decolonizing curriculum. So how does that differ? Because it's a different language, and are the aims different? So I'm just wondering if you could help clarify that.
I'm saying, okay, nobody's gonna. So I purposely used indigenizing in my talk with the ING to make it more active as something we do in our everyday lives, and there's a notion of indigeneity. So in terms of decolonizing, some of the discourse there has been that decolonizing is reactive. It's in reaction to whatever the colonizer or the colonial institution does. So it bans our religion or practices, or does this next bit of legislation, and we have to react, and we're always on the back foot, as Graham Smith puts it. So he says that we need to be more proactive, and when we're more proactive, then we're talking about indigenizing. And this is where indigenizing, I think, has multiple roles. So in the Okanagan, indigenizing is the Okanagan, the Syilx people, reconnecting, re-indigenizing ourselves, cultural aspirations, or taking care of this place and connecting to everybody else. And for everybody else, indigenizing means that not everybody can be Syilx Okanagan here, because there's genealogy and cultural, structures and all of that. But can everybody reach a level of indigeneity, so that our lifeways here are more in accord and more in dynamic balance with the natural world ecosystem here, the self-regenerative capacity of this place, then we say sure, of course, and that's the way it should be. So that's some of the difference between kind of reactive and proactive aspects.
Well, I hate to call it short, but I am going to, because I can feel pressure, that you're going to have a ton of fantastic conversation today. And I also see a lot of hope when I look out at each of you as teachers. This time next year, you'll be in the profession. And I know that the conversations that you're going to have today and have been having and that are continuing are going to turn a lot of hope into concrete actions. So please join me in thanking each of our panel speakers today.